Elizabeth had always been seen as the perfect wife, a woman molded to please, but behind the impeccable smile, she was orchestrating a million-dollar plan. While everyone underestimated her, she was building a silent empire. What would happen when they discovered who the real Elizabeth Morgan truly was? Elizabeth adjusted her red Valentino dress as she looked at herself in the full-length mirror of her master suite. Her fingers glided smoothly over the imported fabric, a gift from Richard, of course, as he made sure to mention whenever he could. The reflection showed a 35-year-old woman, elegant and sophisticated, exactly as her husband liked to display her at social events. But her eyes, her eyes held a different gleam that night. "Darling, are you ready?" Richard's voice echoed through the hallway. "The Harrisons don't like tardiness, you know that." Elizabeth allowed herself a small smile as she applied the last layer of lipstick. Richard always talked about others as if they were inferior, even when it came to his supposed closest friends. Robert Harrison was one of the biggest investors in his company, and yet Richard never missed an opportunity to belittle him behind the scenes. "Almost ready, love." Her voice came out sweet, submissive, as always. It was the tone Richard expected to hear. As she finished getting ready, Elizabeth discreetly checked her secondary cell phone, hidden in a fake purse inside the closet. The notification blinked silently. Transfer completed, 50 million. Another smile, this time different, sharper, crossed her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her usual expression of a devoted wife. "Elizabeth," the impatience in Richard's voice was evident. She put away the phone and picked up her Chanel clutch, another gift that Richard loved to mention to showcase his generosity. As she descended the stairs of the mansion, she found her husband adjusting his Italian tie in front of the hall mirror. Tall, athletic, with graying hair at the temples that only enhanced his air of successful executive, Richard was the embodiment of power at 45 years old. "Finally," he said, turning to her with that smile that mixed affection and condescension. "You look beautiful, my doll." His hands unnecessarily adjusted the strap of her dress. "But next time, let's try to be more punctual, shall we? You know how important these events are for business." "I'm sorry, love, I just wanted to be perfect for you." Elizabeth lowered her eyes, perfectly playing the role he expected. In the EIS car during the journey to the Harrisons' mansion, Richard spent the next 20 minutes going over, as he always did, how Elizabeth should behave. Who she should talk to, what topics to discuss, when to smile, when to stay silent. "The Harrisons' son recently returned from Harvard," Richard commented as the driver navigated through the streets of Westchester County. "Robert's been bragging about the boy's investments in startups, as if throwing money at little backyard companies was something to be proud of." He laughed. That laugh he reserved for when he felt superior to someone. "But pretend to be interested when he starts talking about it. We need to keep Robert happy until we close the merger next quarter." Elizabeth nodded gently, her mind wandering to her own investments in startups that had already multiplied her secret assets several times over. If Richard knew that his little doll had a larger investment portfolio than his, the Harrisons' mansion was an imposing construction in Westchester County with a privileged view of the New York skyline. As they entered the main hall, they were immediately surrounded by the cream of New York society. Richard, as always, made a point of guiding her by the arm, introducing her as if she were another one of his conquests. "Elizabeth, my beautiful wife," he would say to each new group, his hand firm on her waist, a constant reminder of his supposed ownership. "She's the light of my life. I don't know what I'd do without her to take care of our home." Robert Harrison, a 60-year-old man with a shrewd smile, approached with his wife Catherine and his son Alex, newly arrived from Harvard. Elizabeth immediately noticed how young Alex had a different gleam in his eye, the same kind of gleam that she hid so well. "Richard, Elizabeth," Robert greeted them warmly. "So glad you could make it." Alex was eager to meet New York's most successful couple. Elizabeth observed how Richard puffed out his chest at the compliment, completely oblivious to the subtle irony in Robert's voice. She had learned to read people over the years, a skill that her husband, in his arrogance, had never developed. "Alex," Elizabeth addressed the young man with a polite smile. "I heard you're doing some interesting work with startups. The world of innovation must be fascinating." Richard squeezed her waist slightly, a silent warning not to dwell too much on the subject, but Alex had already taken the bait. "Actually, Mrs. Morgan, I'm especially interested in fintechs and blockchain. I believe the future of the financial market lies in decentralization." Elizabeth saw Richard roll his eyes discreetly out of the corner of her eye, but she kept her attention on Alex. "How interesting. And what's your opinion on anonymous investments through cryptocurrencies?" The young Harrison visibly perked up at the question, much to Richard's dismay, who tried to change the subject to the merger he was planning. But Elizabeth had already planted the seed she needed. Later, during dinner, seated at the main table between Richard and Alex, Elizabeth maintained her usual performance of decorative wife, smiling at the right moments, agreeing with her husband's opinions, sipping her champagne with studied elegance. But her mind was racing, processing information, connecting dots, planning her next moves. Richard was particularly expansive that night, perhaps due to the expensive wine or the presence of so many subordinates, as he used to call his partners and investors in private. "You know," he began, raising his glass, "many ask me what the secret of my success is." His gaze swept the table, savoring everyone's attention. "Besides hard work and business vision, of course, I have to thank my Elizabeth." He placed his hand over hers, a gesture that to others seemed loving, but that Elizabeth knew was just another demonstration of dominance. "She's my safe harbor, my inspiration. I take care of everything, so she doesn't have to worry about anything. Other than being beautiful and making our house a home." The guest smiled. Some couples exchanged admiring glances, as if that were the definition of a perfect relationship. Elizabeth maintained her placid smile while inwardly savoring the irony of the situation. If they only knew that Richard's doll had just bought, through a series of shell companies, a significant percentage of her husband's company shares. "Richard is right," she said, her melodious voice carrying a sweetness that only Alex seemed to perceive as artificial. "I'm very blessed to have a husband who takes such good care of me. I don't even know how these business and investment things work. It's all so complicated." As the men laughed condescendingly, Elizabeth exchanged a quick glance with Alex. The young Harrison had a half smile on his lips, as if he had caught something that the others had missed. She had chosen her first ally well. After dinner, when the guests spread out again in the hall for drinks and networking, Elizabeth managed a few moments alone in the Harrisons' winter garden, under the pretext of needing fresh air. She checked her secret cell phone again. Besides the transfer confirmation, there was a message from her financial advisor. Phoenix operation underway, phase 1 completed. Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Her plan was in motion, the pieces fitting together perfectly. Richard continued inside, boasting of his achievements, completely unaware that his precious company was no longer entirely his. Soon, very soon, he would discover in the hardest way that he had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the woman he treated as a luxury doll. "Mrs. Morgan?" Alex's voice surprised her, but she showed no startlement. "Sorry to interrupt your moment of peace. Please call me Elizabeth." She discreetly put away her phone. "And you're not interrupting anything." Alex approached, maintaining a respectful distance. "You know, it's interesting how some people can be so blind." "How so?" "My father taught me early on to never judge a book by its cover." He paused significantly. "Or a company by its apparent CEO." Elizabeth let an enigmatic smile play on her lips. "Your father seems to be a very wise man, Alex." "He is. And he's also very good at recognizing value where others only see decoration." The young man took a business card from his pocket and handed it to Elizabeth. It was completely black, with only a golden QR code printed on it. "If you ever want to discuss more about fintechs and blockchain," he smiled, "I'm sure it would be a very productive conversation." Elizabeth accepted the card, tucking it into her clutch. "Thank you, Alex. Maybe someday." When Richard appeared to fetch her minutes later, he found her admiring the orchids in the winter garden, the perfect image of the idle wife satisfied with her life of luxury. Ready to go, my love? He wrapped his arm possessively around her waist. You were great today. Robert was very impressed with our harmony as a couple. That's good, dear. Elizabeth rested her head on his shoulder, playing for the 1000th time the role he expected. I just want you to be proud of me. On the way back home, while Richard talked non-stop about how the night had been a success and how everyone envied their perfect marriage, Elizabeth thought about the QR code in her purse and how her double life was about to take another crucial step towards her liberation. Elizabeth's private office was hidden on the 20th floor of a discreet commercial building in the Upper East Side. Registered under the name of a consulting company, the space was her true sanctuary. There, away from Richard's controlling eyes, she could be who she really was, a shrewd and determined businesswoman. The morning after the Harrisons' dinner, Elizabeth arrived early at the office, using a common pretext to leave home, her Pilates class, which Richard approved of, because it kept her in shape for him. Dressed in an elegant Chanel ensemble that she had bought herself, although Richard thought it was a gift from him, she sat at her minimalist design desk and activated the QR code that Alex had given her. The screen of her laptop displayed a sophisticated cryptocurrency trading interface. A discreet message flashed in the corner. Welcome, Phoenix. Elizabeth smiled. Alex was even more perceptive than she had imagined. He already knew who she was in the world of digital investments. Helen, Elizabeth called her assistant through the intercom. Can you come here, please? Helen entered the room immediately. Tall, elegant, and extremely competent, she was one of the few people who knew Elizabeth's true identity in the business world. Yes, ma'am? I need you to prepare a complete analysis of my husband's company's latest acquisitions, especially those he made in the last 6 months without consulting the board. Elizabeth swiveled in her chair, observing the panoramic view of New York. And schedule a lunch with Alex Harrison for today. He just confirmed his participation in Project Phoenix. Helen made quick notes on her tablet. The report from the last financial movement arrived. Mr. Morgan hasn't noticed anything yet, but his company's shares have fallen 2% since we started buying through the front companies. Elizabeth nodded, satisfied. It was just the beginning. And what about that problem with the Asian contract? Resolved. Our contact in Singapore managed to make it look like a bureaucratic error. Mr. Morgan lost the $50 million deal, but there's no way to trace our involvement. Elizabeth's personal phone vibrated. It was Richard. She immediately softened her voice as she answered. Hi, love. Elizabeth, darling, where are you? His voice sounded controlling as always. At Pilates class, remember? You yourself said it was important for me to maintain my exercise routine. Ah, yes, of course. He seemed satisfied with the answer. Listen, tonight we'll have an important dinner at home. The bank people will come to discuss some investments. I want you dazzling, as always. Elizabeth signaled to Helen, who immediately began to reorganize her schedule. Of course, love. What time will they arrive? At 8. And, Elizabeth. He paused. Wear that blue dress I gave you last month. You look even more beautiful in it. As you wish, dear. As soon as she hung up, her expression changed completely. Helen, move up the lunch with Alex to noon and prepare the dossier on the tax irregularities we found. Tonight we'll have a perfect opportunity. The restaurant chosen for the meeting with Alex was discreet and elegant, frequented mainly by executives. Elizabeth arrived first, choosing a secluded table that ensured privacy. When Alex entered a few minutes later, she noticed that he also knew how to play the game of appearances. He wore an impeccable Armani suit, looking exactly like the type of young executive who would be having lunch with a potential investor. Mrs. Morgan, he greeted formally for the benefit of anyone who might be observing. Alex, please, I already told you to call me Elizabeth. She indicated the chair across from her. Or perhaps you prefer to call me Phoenix. The young man smiled, sitting down. So it's true. The legendary anonymous investor who's been causing a stir in the financial market is Richard Morgan's trophy. Wife, brilliant. You're not exactly who you appear to be either, are you? Elizabeth signaled for the waiter to bring the wine she had already selected. Robert Harrison's prodigy son, fresh out of Harvard, but who actually already controls one of the largest cryptocurrency investment networks in North America. Alex visibly relaxed, as if relieved to be able to take off his own mask. My father knows, of course. He's the one who taught me that the best moves are made in the shadows. But I confess that you... He paused admiringly. You've taken the game to another level. The wine was served, a Chateau Margaux that Elizabeth knew how to appreciate, unlike the image of a wife who only drank champagne at social events. I have a proposal for you, Alex. Something that can multiply your cryptocurrency investments and at the same time help me complete my personal project. The famous Project Phoenix. Alex leaned in, interested. The entire market speculates about it. Some say it's a new blockchain technology. Others bet on a revolutionary investment network. But no one imagines that it's actually a revenge plan, is it? Elizabeth tasted the wine, savoring not just its flavor, but the moment. Revenge is a very strong word. I prefer to call it poetic justice. Richard spent years treating me like her brainless doll, displaying me as a trophy, while I built an empire larger than his. Her eyes sparkled. Now it's time to reveal who's really in control. And where do I fit into this plan? I need someone with your expertise in cryptocurrencies to create a perfect smokescreen. When Richard starts losing control of his company, he'll try to track the investors. I need all the money I'm using to buy his shares to seem to come from different international sources. Alex took a sip of his wine, thoughtful. That explains why you started probing the merger with my father's company. Richard hasn't realized it yet, but when he realizes he's losing control, he'll try to cling to any powerful ally. Exactly, Elizabeth smiled. Is your father in on the game too? Robert Harrison never liked the way Richard treats people. He only maintains the partnership because it's profitable, but if a better alternative comes along... Alex left the sentence hanging. The lunch proceeded with the two discussing technical and strategic details, always maintaining a facade of casual conversation for any external observer. Elizabeth explained how she had already acquired 15% of Richard's company's shares through different shell companies, and how she planned to reach 51% before revealing her identity. Timing is crucial, she explained, as dessert was being served. Richard has an important meeting with investors tonight at our house. He's going to try to secure a significant contribution to expand the company into the Asian market. The same market where he mysteriously lost that $50 million contract. Alex raised an eyebrow, amused. Exactly. And tonight, during dinner, some compromising documents about his financial management might accidentally end up in the investors' hands. Elizabeth, Alex leaned in, lowering his voice, you're even more brilliant than the rumors said. But allow me to give you some advice. Don't underestimate Richard. Men like him, when cornered, can be dangerous. Elizabeth's smile hid a shadow of concern that she quickly masked. Don't worry. I've spent years studying his every move, every possible reaction. Richard is predictable in his arrogance. He would never imagine that his little doll could be capable of something like this. When lunch ended, they said goodbye formally, like two acquaintances who had a casual meeting. But before leaving, Alex briefly held Elizabeth's hand. I'm in, he said simply. Project Phoenix has just gained a new ally. Back at her office, Elizabeth spent the next few hours finalizing preparations for that evening's dinner. Helen entered and exited several times, bringing documents for signature and updates on financial movements. Ma'am, Helen said during one of her entries, some interesting information just came in. Richard tried to make a large transfer today, but the bank blocked it due to suspicion of irregularity. Elizabeth allowed herself a satisfied smile. It seems our friend at the bank fulfilled his part. Richard must be furious. He's already called the manager 3 times, demanding explanations. Perfect. That will make him nervous for tonight's dinner. Elizabeth stood up, adjusting her blazer. It's time for me to go back home and prepare for another night as the perfect wife. Before leaving, she checked her secret messages one more time. Everything was running according to plan. The documents that would prove Richard's tax irregularities were already in the possession of one of the investors who would attend the dinner. Her plan was in motion, the gears turning silently. In the elevator, Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of reflection. This would be a decisive night, the first, truly visible move of her plan. After this, there would be no turning back. Richard would start to feel the ground disappear beneath his feet, and the best part of all, he wouldn't even imagine that his own wife was responsible for his downfall. Showtime, she murmured to herself, as her private driver, whom Richard didn't know existed, took her back home where she would resume her role as submissive wife for the last time. The aroma of fine spices filled the Morgan mansion as Elizabeth supervised the last details of the dinner. Dressed in the elegant blue dress chosen by Richard, she seemed the perfect hostess, moving gracefully through the house while giving discreet instructions to the service staff. "Elizabeth," Richard's voice thundered from the study, "come here for a minute." She found her husband pacing back and forth, his face red with irritation. The call from the bank earlier had clearly affected him. "Yes, dear. The dinner needs to be perfect tonight." He stopped in front of her, unnecessarily adjusting the collar of her dress. These investors represent a crucial capital injection for the company's expansion, especially after that fiasco with the Asian contract. "Everything will be fine, love." Elizabeth gently touched his face, a gesture she knew calmed him. "Trust me." Richard held her hand, kissing it. "What would I do without you, my doll? So sweet, so dedicated." He smiled, that smile that mixed affection and superiority. "Leave the serious matters to me, all right? You just need to be your lovely self." Elizabeth nodded docilely, while inwardly savoring the irony of the situation. If Richard knew that every detail of that dinner had been meticulously planned by her. The doorbell rang punctually at 8 o'clock. The first to arrive were Charles and Beatrice Montgomery from the country's largest investment bank. Soon after came the Zhang brothers, investors from Singapore whom Richard was desperate to impress after the failure of the Asian contract. "Elizabeth, darling," Beatrice embraced her warmly, "that dress is spectacular. Richard always had good taste." "Thank you," Elizabeth smiled, noticing her husband's satisfied expression out of the corner of her eye. "Please make yourselves comfortable. Dinner will be served shortly." While Richard led the men to the bar for preliminary drinks, Elizabeth and Beatrice headed to the living room. The banker's wife was known for her sharp tongue and enviable network of contacts. "So, Elizabeth," Beatrice began, lowering her voice, "did you hear about the scandal at the Harrison Company?" Elizabeth kept her expression neutral, although her heart raced slightly. "What scandal?" "Apparently, young Alex has been making some quite daring moves in the market. They say he's involved with a mysterious investor, known only as Phoenix." Beatrice leaned in as if sharing a precious secret. "Some more malicious tongues suggest that this Phoenix is behind the recent fall in your husband's stocks." Elizabeth let out a delicate laugh. "Oh, Beatrice, you know I don't understand anything about these business things. Richard takes care of all that." At that moment, the door to the living room opened, and Alex Harrison entered, impeccable in his Italian suit. Elizabeth noticed the flash of surprise in Richard's eyes. Clearly, her husband wasn't expecting the young man's presence. "Alex?" Richard recovered quickly. "I didn't know you were coming. Your invitation was for interested investors, wasn't it?" Alex smiled, greeting everyone. "And let's say I have some interesting proposals to discuss." Dinner was served in the spacious dining room, the table set with the finest French porcelain and Venetian crystal. Elizabeth took her place to Richard's right, as always, but this time there was a different energy in the air. Each glass of wine, each forkful, each smile was part of a carefully rehearsed choreography. "Richard," Charles Montgomery began, while savoring the lamb in wine, "I have to admit that we're a bit concerned about some rumors that have been circulating in the market." Richard tensed imperceptibly. "What kind of rumors?" "Well," Charles removed an envelope from his briefcase, "I received some documents today that suggest certain irregularities in your latest tax declarations." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth kept her eyes fixed on her plate, perfectly playing the role of a wife oblivious to business matters. "This is absurd." Richard tried to maintain his composure, but his voice trembled slightly. "I can explain every cent that passes through my company." "No one is accusing anyone," Alex intervened smoothly. but you have to admit that it's intriguing. How your shares have been systematically falling in recent weeks, exactly when these documents started circulating. Elizabeth observed the drop of sweat that trickled down Richard's temple. She knew her husband was mentally reviewing every move, every decision, trying to understand where he had lost control. "If I may," Mrs. Zhang's soft voice cut through the tension. "Perhaps it's time to consider restructuring the board." Richard paled. "What do you mean?" "Investors are nervous, Richard," Charles explained. "We need guarantees. A new governance structure, perhaps with a more diversified board." Elizabeth chose this moment to intervene, her voice sweet and apparently naive. "But darling, you always say that your company is like your family. I'm sure you can explain all this, can't you?" The look Richard gave her was a mixture of gratitude and condescension. He still believed she was trying to help. "Elizabeth is right," he forced a smile. "I can explain everything. If you give me a few days, I'll prepare a detailed report." "Of course," Alex smiled, exchanging an imperceptible look with Elizabeth. "In the meantime, perhaps we should discuss that merger proposal my father mentioned." The rest of the dinner proceeded in an atmosphere of poorly disguised tension. Richard alternated between attempts to regain control of the situation and moments of worried silence. Elizabeth maintained her impeccable performance, serving more wine, smiling at the right moments, occasionally touching her husband's arm in gestures of support. When the last guests departed, it was already past midnight. Richard went straight to his study, leaving Elizabeth alone in the living room. She could hear him on the phone, his voice altered as he tried to contact his lawyers. In her closet, protected by several layers of designer clothes, Elizabeth checked her secret cell phone. There was a message from Alex. "First phase completed. Successfully. The documents caused the expected impact. Next move in 48 hours. She smiled, putting the phone away, as she heard Richard's footsteps approaching. Her husband entered the bedroom looking 10 years older. "Elizabeth," he sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "I need your help." "Of course, love. What can I do?" "Tomorrow, I want you to go to the bank and transfer all your jewelry and artwork to a new safe deposit box, in your name." He ran his hand through his graying hair. "It's just a precaution." Elizabeth felt a pang of satisfaction. Richard was starting to feel fear, but still, his first reaction was to try to protect his assets by putting them in the name of the wife he considered incapable of making any financial decision. "Don't worry, dear." She hugged him, feeling him relax in her arms. "Everything will be all right. You always say you're smarter than all of them." Richard fell into an uneasy sleep, while Elizabeth remained awake, planning her next moves. Tomorrow, while he thought she would be at the bank transferring jewelry, she would have a crucial meeting with her lawyers. The next phase of Project Phoenix was about to begin, and this time the blow would be even more painful to Richard's ego. Outside the mansion, a discreet car briefly parked. The driver left an envelope in the mailbox and silently departed into the night. Inside the envelope, documents that would forever change the Morgans' fate awaited the dawn. The morning after, the dinner dawned cloudy in New York, a perfect reflection of the mood in the Morgan mansion. Elizabeth woke up early, as always, and found Richard already in his study. He hadn't slept, the deep circles under his eyes and loose tie betraying a night of worries. "Good morning, love." She entered the study softly, bringing a cup of coffee prepared exactly as he liked it. "Have you been here all night?" Richard barely raised his eyes from the papers scattered across his desk. "The jewelry, Elizabeth." "Don't forget to go to the bank today." "Of course, dear. I'll go right after I finish my Pilates class." She placed the cup beside him, noticing the headlines on the financial newspapers open on his tablet. Morgan Enterprises stocks in free fall. Investors question Richard Morgan's management. And Elizabeth. He finally looked at her, his eyes revealing a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Don't comment about yesterday with anyone, not even with your friends at the club. You know you can trust me, Richard." Elizabeth touched his tense shoulder. "I've always been your biggest supporter, haven't I?" As soon as she left the mansion, Elizabeth headed not to Pilates or the bank, but to her secret office. Helen was already waiting for her with the latest updates. "The stocks fell another 5% since the market opened," her assistant informed. handing her a detailed report. "And the envelope we left in the mailbox last night?" "Richard hasn't seen it yet." Elizabeth smiled, exchanging her Hermes bag for a more discreet one. "He's so worried about the documents from the dinner that he didn't even check the mail. But our source in his office confirmed that his secretary has already found the envelope." Elizabeth's phone vibrated. It was a message from Alex. "Emergency board meeting called for this afternoon. Richard is in panic." She replied quickly, "Perfect. Keep our friend in Singapore informed. I want the Jangs to withdraw their investment. By the end of the week." "Ma'am," Helen interrupted her thoughts. "Robert Harrison is on the line." Elizabeth answered, her voice assuming a professional tone that Richard would never recognize. "Robert, what a pleasant surprise." "Elizabeth, my dear," the voice of the experienced businessman sounded amused, "I must say I'm impressed. Richard spent the whole morning trying to convince me to make an emergency investment in his company." "And what did you say?" "That I'd need to consult my lawyers, of course, but actually, I'm more interested in knowing when you plan to reveal yourself as the mysterious phoenix to the board." Elizabeth allowed herself a soft laugh. "Everything has its time, Robert. For now, I need you to continue being the helpful friend who is genuinely concerned about Richard's situation. You're an extraordinary woman, Elizabeth. Richard was a fool not to realize that before." After hanging up, Elizabeth reviewed the next steps of her plan with Helen. The board meeting would be crucial. Even though she wouldn't be physically present, her pieces were perfectly positioned. "Are the documents for the meeting ready?" she asked. Helen nodded, handing her a folder. "All here, including the evidence that Richard has been using company resources to maintain a lifestyle incompatible with his declared income." "Excellent." Elizabeth leafed through the documents. "And that little problem with the apartment in Paris?" "Resolved. We managed to prove that he bought the property with company money without declaring it to the board." Elizabeth's personal phone rang again. It was Richard. She quickly resumed her role as dedicated wife. "Hi, love." "Elizabeth, where are you?" His voice sounded tense. "I stopped by the bank and you weren't there." "Oh dear, I'm sorry. The Pilates class ran late, and then I stopped by the jeweler's to have the pieces appraised before taking them to the bank." The lie flowed as smooth as silk. "Do you want me to come home now?" No, he sighed. Just do what I asked with the jewelry, all right? And Elizabeth, and are you sure you didn't comment about yesterday with anyone?" "Richard, you know you can trust me. I'm your wife. I'm always by your side." As soon as she hung up, Elizabeth turned her attention to her laptop. The news about the crisis at Morgan Enterprises was spreading rapidly. Specialized blogs were beginning to question Richard's ability to lead the company, and some even mentioned rumors about possible tax irregularities. "Helen," Elizabeth called her assistant again, "prepare document B3 for sending. It's time we leak those photos of the Paris apartment. With all the media coverage, this could be the final blow to his reputation," Helen observed. "Not yet." Elizabeth smiled, a smile that mixed determination and a hint of sadness. "The final blow will be when he discovers who's really behind all this. But first, I want him to feel the same thing I felt for all these years, the sensation of slowly losing control, unable to do anything to stop it." The rest of the morning passed in a series of virtual meetings with strategic investors. Elizabeth, under her Phoenix pseudonym, was gradually consolidating her position in the market. Each move was calculated, each decision precisely timed, to maximize the impact on Richard's company. Close to lunchtime, she received another message from Alex. "Just got out of a preliminary meeting. Richard is considering selling part of his shares to raise capital." "Perfect," she replied. "Keep our buyers on standby. When he decides to sell, I want the price to be artificially and strategically low." Elizabeth checked the clock. It was time to return home and resume her role. Richard would certainly be nervous about the board meeting, and she needed to be there, being the perfect and supportive wife he always wanted her to be. Before leaving, she opened her personal safe and removed a sealed envelope. Inside it was the document that could instantly destroy Richard, the definitive proof of his financial manipulations over the years. But it wasn't time yet. Elizabeth wanted him to slowly taste the bitter flavor of defeat, to savor every drop of despair before the final blow. "Ma'am," Helen called her one last time, "don't forget that tonight is the Rivera Foundation charity cocktail. Did Richard confirm his attendance?" "Yes," Elizabeth smiled, "and it will be the perfect setting for the next act of our plan. After all, there's nothing high society appreciates more than seeing the fall of one of its most prominent members." On the way home, Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of reflection. The plan was working perfectly, each piece moving exactly as she had foreseen. But there were moments, brief instants, when she felt a twinge of, not exactly remorse, but perhaps nostalgia. There was a time when she truly loved Richard, when she believed she could be happy being just his little doll. But those times had been left behind, buried under years of condescension, control, and subtle humiliations. Now it was time for Richard to learn that his greatest weakness had been underestimating the woman he thought he had under his complete control. Upon arriving home, she found Richard preparing for the board meeting. He looked more dejected than ever. "Elizabeth," he called her, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Do you think I'm a good husband?" For a moment, Elizabeth felt her heart falter, but then she remembered all the times he had belittled her, treated her like a brainless doll, controlled every aspect of her life. "The best of all, love," she answered, her smile masking the truth that would soon come to light. "The best of all." The golden ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled under the crystal chandeliers as New York's elite gathered for the Rivera Foundation charity cocktail. Elizabeth, stunning in a red Valentino dress, this time actually bought by Richard in one of his last attempts to keep up appearances, watched her husband nervously circulate among the guests. The board meeting that afternoon had been devastating. Richard still didn't know, but Elizabeth had watched everything through a secret transmission arranged by Alex. Her husband, always so confident and domineering, had stuttered while trying to explain the inconsistencies in his financial reports. "Elizabeth, darling," Beatrice Montgomery approached, champagne flute in hand, "you look simply magnificent. How do you always manage to maintain such serenity?" "Oh, you know how it is, Beatrice," Elizabeth smiled sweetly. "A wife should be her husband's safe harbor, shouldn't she? Speaking of which," Beatrice lowered her voice, leaning in, "is it true what they're saying about Richard's company? Charles told me that the meeting today was tense." Elizabeth allowed a shadow of concern to cross her perfectly made-up face. "Richard is a brilliant man. I'm sure any misunderstanding will be clarified." From across the room, she could see Richard talking intensely with Robert Harrison. Her husband was gesticulating more than usual, his normally controlled face betraying signs of desperation. "Excuse me, Beatrice." Elizabeth smiled gracefully, moving away. Her timing had to be perfect. She intercepted Alex near the bar, maintaining a socially appropriate distance. "How was the meeting after I disconnected?" "Brutal," Alex murmured, pretending to examine the wine list. "Your husband tried to propose a restructuring of the board, but they rejected it. They want a complete audit." "And the Zhangs?" "They confirmed they'll withdraw their investment tomorrow. Richard doesn't know yet." Elizabeth nodded discreetly, her gaze wandering the room until she found her next mark. Jennifer Rivera, the event's hostess and one of the biggest influencers in the financial market through her podcast, was surrounded by admirers. "Excuse me," Elizabeth murmured to Alex, moving towards Jennifer. The presenter smiled widely upon seeing her. "Elizabeth, so glad you could make it. Is Richard around?" "Yes, he's..." Elizabeth made a calculated pause, letting her voice waver. "Slightly. He's talking with some investors." Jennifer, known for her nose for stories, immediately caught the change in tone. "Is everything all right, dear?" "Oh yes, of course." Elizabeth forced a smile, knowing her performance would be the perfect fuel for the next episode of Jennifer's podcast. "You know how these businessmen are. Sometimes they get so absorbed in their work." "Elizabeth," Richard's voice cut off her sentence. He approached quickly, placing a possessive arm around her waist. "Jennifer, what a wonderful event. Your foundation always exceeds expectations." Jennifer observed the interaction with keen eyes. The Richard Morgan in front of her was not the same confident man who used to dominate these events. There was something in his eyes, a kind of barely contained desperation. "Richard," Jennifer smiled, "I was just commenting to Elizabeth how busy you've been lately. I read some interesting news about Morgan Enterprises." "Rumors," Richard cut in brusquely. "The market is full of ill-intentioned speculators." Elizabeth felt his fingers tighten around her waist more firmly. In the E. Past, this gesture would have intimidated her. Now it was just another confirmation that her plan was working. "If you'll excuse me," Elizabeth said softly, "I need to touch up my makeup." In the luxurious hotel bathroom, Elizabeth met with Helen, who was waiting for her as planned. "The Paris apartment documents have been released," her assistant informed in a low voice. "Jennifer will receive the anonymous tip on her podcast tomorrow morning." "Excellent." Elizabeth retouched her lipstick, observing her reflection in the mirror. "And that other matter?" "Resolved. The Swiss bank confirmed the transfer. All evidence of irregular transactions is secure." When Elizabeth returned to the ballroom, she found Richard surrounded by a group of investors. His body language betrayed his discomfort: tense shoulders, forced smile, the way his eyes nervously scanned the environment. "Ah, Elizabeth," he called her, relief evident in his voice. "Come here, my love. I was just telling these gentlemen how you're my greatest support." Elizabeth glided to his side, perfectly playing the role of devoted wife. "Richard is my hero," she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "I don't know what I'd do without him." The investors exchanged significant glances. Elizabeth could feel the change in the air. The respect Richard used to command was turning into something close to pity. "Elizabeth," one of the older investors addressed her, "you must be very worried about this whole situation." Before Richard could intervene, Elizabeth let her eyes fill with carefully rehearsed tears. "Richard is a strong man. I'm sure he'll solve everything." The effect was immediate. The investors looked at each other again, this time with expressions that mixed compassion and discomfort. Elizabeth had planted the perfect seed, the image of the devoted and naive wife, worried about her husband in trouble. "Elizabeth," Richard whispered tensely as soon as they were alone, "I don't want you commenting about business with anyone, understood?" "I'm sorry, love." She lowered her eyes, submissive. "I was just trying to help." The rest of the night unfolded as Elizabeth had planned, each interaction carefully choreographed, each word measured to maximize impact. Richard was drinking more than usual, his habitual composure unraveling with each glass of whiskey. Near the end of the event, Elizabeth observed him from afar as he gestured heatedly in a discussion with Robert Harrison. Her secret cell phone vibrated in her purse. It was a message from Alex. "Just received confirmation. The Zhangs will announce the withdrawal of their investment tomorrow at 9 a.m., market opening time." Elizabeth allowed herself a small smile. In less than 12 hours, Morgan Enterprises shares would suffer their biggest fall. And Richard, her husband, who always treated her like a brainless doll, still had no idea that his own safe harbor was the architect of his destruction. "Shall we go home, Richard?" she suggested softly, approaching him. "You look tired." In the car, Richard remained silent, his face occasionally illuminated by the city lights. Elizabeth could see the gears turning in his mind, desperately trying to find a way out of the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Elizabeth," he finally spoke, his voice hoarse, Do you think someone is trying to destroy me?" She placed her hand over his, feeling him tremble slightly. "Who could want that, love? You've always been so generous to everyone." Richard nodded distractedly, lost in his thoughts. He didn't notice the gleam of satisfaction in his wife's eyes, nor did he notice the small smile that played on her lips when he mentioned the word destroy. At home, while Richard sank into his study with a bottle of whiskey, Elizabeth went up to her closet. Tomorrow would be a decisive day. Soon, very soon, Richard would discover that his greatest threat had always been by his side, smiling sweetly, while planning his downfall. The sun had barely risen when Elizabeth woke to the sound of glass shattering in the study. Richard, who hadn't slept all night, had just received the news. The Zhangs had publicly announced their withdrawal from Morgan Enterprises, citing concerns about current management as the reason. Impossible. His voice echoed through the corridors of the mansion. They can't do this, I had guarantees. Elizabeth calmly got up, put on her silk robe, and descended the stairs with the studied concern of a devoted wife. She found Richard in his study, surrounded by shards of what was once an expensive Italian vase, his laptop displaying the devastating headlines of the day. "Richard!" She kept her voice soft, controlled. "What happened?" He turned to her, his face a mask of fury and despair. "The stocks, they're plummeting. The Zhangs. Those traitors," his voice faltered. "Elizabeth, everything is falling apart." She approached him, carefully avoiding the glass shards on the floor. "There must be something we can do, right? You always say you're smarter than all of them." Richard ran his hands through his graying hair, now completely disheveled. "I don't understand. First those documents at the dinner, then the rumors about irregularities, now this." His eyes suddenly narrowed. It's as if someone was orchestrating everything. His phone rang. It was Robert Harrison. Richard answered on speakerphone, his voice trying to regain some composure. "Richard," Robert's voice sounded grave. "I imagine you've already seen the news." "Robert, I need your help. That merger proposal we discussed." "I'm sorry, Richard," Robert interrupted him. "But after the Zhang's announcement, my company's board decided to re-evaluate any partnership with Morgan Enterprises." Elizabeth watched the scene with apparent concern, but inwardly savored every moment, especially because she knew what would come next. As if on cue, Richard's cell phone vibrated with a notification. It was the link to the newest episode of Jennifer Rivera's podcast, High Society Scandal, The Morgan Empire and the Secret Apartment, in Paris. "No," Richard whispered, his voice trembling as he clicked on the link. Jennifer's elegant voice filled the study. "Exclusive sources revealed today documents that prove the existence of a luxurious apartment in Paris, valued at millions of euros, bought with Morgan Enterprises resources without the knowledge of the board or shareholders." Richard abruptly turned off the audio, but the damage was done. His phone started ringing incessantly. Journalists, shareholders, board members, all wanting explanations. "Elizabeth," he turned to her, his eyes revealing a desperation she had never seen before. "I need you to do something for me. Anything, love. Go to the bank now. Transfer all the money from our joint accounts to a new account, only in your name." He started frantically searching for something on his computer. "And those artworks we bought last year, I want you to sell them. Immediately." Elizabeth allowed an expression of confusion to cross her face. "But Richard, you always said I didn't understand anything about business. Are you sure you want me to handle this? You're the only one I can trust now." He gripped her arms tightly. "Promise you'll do exactly what I asked." "Of course, love." She touched his face affectionately. "I'll get ready and leave right away." As she climbed the stairs, Elizabeth could hear Richard making desperate phone calls, trying to contain the approaching tsunami. Little did he know that each attempt at salvation would only sink him deeper. In her closet, Elizabeth checked her secret cell phone. There were messages from Alex confirming that the operation at the bank was ready. Any attempt by Richard to move large amounts would be automatically blocked due to suspicion of irregularities. Helen had also sent an update. Morgan Enterprises. Board had called an extraordinary meeting for that afternoon. The agenda? The possible replacement of Richard from the presidency. Elizabeth dressed with special care, choosing a Chanel ensemble that she had bought herself, although Richard thought it was a gift from him. She needed to look impeccable for what was to come. When she came down, she found Richard watching a live report about the crisis in the company. The presenter was talking about a mysterious investor known as Phoenix, who had been systematically buying Morgan Enterprises shares through different shell companies. "Who is this Phoenix?" Richard muttered, more to himself than to Elizabeth. "How did she get so much power over my company without me noticing?" "Maybe it's someone closer than you imagine," Elizabeth replied softly, her voice carrying a double meaning that Richard, in his despair, didn't catch. In the car on the way to the supposed bank, Elizabeth made a crucial call using her secret phone. Is everything ready for this afternoon? Yes, ma'am, Helen responded. The lawyers confirmed that we have control of 49% of the shares. With the next acquisition, which will be made exactly at 3 p.m., we'll reach the majority. Perfect. Elizabeth smiled, observing the city through the car window. And that other matter? The confidential investigation we initiated into Mr. Morgan's financial activities over the last 5 years is complete. The results are interesting. Send everything to Alex. I want him to present the findings at the board meeting today. Arriving at her secret office, Elizabeth found Alex already waiting for her. The young Harrison seemed anxious. Are you sure you want to do this today? He asked as soon as she entered. Once we reveal your identity as Phoenix, there's no turning back. Elizabeth sat in her chair, a posture very different from Richard's submissive wife. For years he treated me like a brainless doll, displaying me as a trophy while belittling my intelligence. Her eyes sparkled with determination. It's time for Richard to discover who really has the power. The phone on her desk rang. It was Richard again. Elizabeth immediately softened her voice. Hi, love. I'm at the bank right now. Elizabeth, listen. He sounded even more desperate. Forget the bank. I need you to come to the company now. There's a board meeting and I need you by my side. Elizabeth allowed an enigmatic smile to cross her lips. Of course, Richard. I'll always be by your side. Hanging up the phone, she turned to Alex. It's time. Prepare everything for the meeting. Today, Richard Morgan will discover that his biggest mistake was underestimating his own wife. The young man nodded and left, leaving Elizabeth alone with her thoughts. She stood up and walked to the window, observing the city that would soon know her name. No longer as Richard Morgan's submissive wife, but as the powerful Phoenix who built an empire in the shadows. The moment of truth was approaching, and Elizabeth could hardly wait to see the expression on Richard's face when he finally understood that his precious little doll had been his downfall all along. The boardroom of Morgan Enterprises was filled with tension when Elizabeth arrived. The board members already occupied their usual places around the imposing mahogany table, while Richard stood by the window, his reflection in the glass revealing a man on the verge of collapse. Elizabeth, my love. He turned upon seeing her, his face lighting up with momentary relief. I'm so glad you came. She noticed the pitying looks the board members exchanged, all imagining that Richard's fragile wife was there merely to provide moral support to her disgraced husband. If they only knew. Gentlemen, Richard addressed the board, his voice trying to recover its usual authority. Before we begin, I'd like to... Richard, Robert Harrison interrupted him gently. I think it's better if we wait for our special guest. Guest? Richard frowned. What guest? As if answering his question, the doors to the room opened and Helen entered, carrying a folder of documents. Elizabeth observed with inner satisfaction how her husband didn't even look twice at the assistant. He never paid attention to people he considered subordinate. The investor known as Phoenix has confirmed her presence, Helen announced, placing the folder on the table. She will arrive momentarily. Richard visibly paled. What do you mean? This meeting is private. I don't authorize the presence of... You're no longer in a position to authorize anything, Richard. Alex Harrison, who had remained quiet until then, spoke up. Phoenix now holds 51% of the company's shares. The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth could practically hear the gears turning in Richard's mind as he tried to process the information. Impossible, he finally managed to say. I've been monitoring all share movements. No one could... No one. Elizabeth rose smoothly, her voice assuming a tone that Richard had never heard before. Are you sure, dear? The look of confusion on his face would be comical under other circumstances. Elizabeth, sit down. You don't understand any of this. On the contrary, Richard, she walked to the head of the table, occupying the chair that had always been his. I understand much more than you imagine. Understanding began to slowly dawn in his eyes. What are you doing? Elizabeth opened the folder that Helen had brought, revealing a series of documents. Gentlemen of the board, may I introduce myself properly? She smiled, a smile different from any Richard had ever seen on her face. I am Phoenix. The shock was immediate. Some board members gasped, others leaned forward in their chairs. Richard looked as if he had been struck by lightning. "No, it can't be," he stammered. "You're just your little doll," Elizabeth completed, her voice now carrying years of pent-up resentment. "The trophy wife who knew nothing about business, the woman you made sure to keep dependent and submissive." She began distributing the documents around the table. "While you were busy showing me off at social events and controlling my friendships, I built an empire. Every time you called me your little girl in public, I bought another piece of your company through different shell companies." Richard staggered to a chair, collapsing into it. "But the money, how?" "Oh, darling," Elizabeth smiled. "Remember when you gave me that first investment in Bitcoin 5 years ago? Something for you to distract yourself with, were your exact words. Well, that was your first and biggest mistake." Alex took the floor, projecting a series of graphs on the room's screen. Phoenix, or should I say Elizabeth, turned that initial investment into a digital empire. Cryptocurrencies, startups, technology companies, all managed with absolute discretion and competence. "But I controlled all your accounts," Richard protested weakly. "All the accounts you knew about," Elizabeth corrected. "Each expensive gift you gave me, each piece of jewelry, each work of art, I discreetly sold and reinvested. You were so busy boasting about your generosity that you never realized you were actually financing your own downfall." Robert Harrison cleared his throat, a discreet smile on his lips. "I must admit, Elizabeth, that your strategy was brilliant. Using Richard's own arrogance against him." "You knew?" Richard turned to Robert and Alex, betrayed. "You knew all along?" "Not all along," Alex replied. "But when we found out, we were too impressed not to want to be part of the project." Elizabeth stood up, walking over to stand beside Richard. "For years, you treated me like property, like someone who should be grateful for your crumbs of attention and control. You never realized that I could be more than your luxury doll." She turned to the board. "Gentlemen, as the majority shareholder, I have some proposals for restructuring the company. First of them, the immediate replacement of the current president." "You can't do this," Richard tried to argue, but his voice no longer had any strength. "I'm the founder of this company." "I can and I will," Elizabeth responded calmly. "And don't worry, dear. Unlike you, I don't intend to leave you with nothing. You can keep the mansion and a generous salary as a consultant. After all," she smiled sweetly, "a wife should take good care of her husband, shouldn't she?" The irony in her words made some board members hide smiles. Richard sank even further into his chair, defeated. "You'll find in the folder in front of you a detailed restructuring plan," Elizabeth continued, resuming her place at the head of the table. "I suggest we begin with the vote for the new presidency." As the board members examined the documents, Elizabeth observed Richard, the man who for so long had made her feel small, now reduced to a shadow of his former self. There was no hatred in her heart, just the satisfaction of finally showing her true strength. "Oh, and Richard," she added, softly, "remember when you said I would never be anything without you? Well, I think you were wrong, weren't you?" The sound of papers being leafed through filled the room, as Richard remained silent, finally understanding the magnitude of his error in underestimating the woman he thought he had tamed. The phoenix had risen from the ashes of her forced submission, and now it was time to fly. News about the revolution at Morgan Enterprises spread like wildfire through New York's high society. The corridors of the corporate building buzzed with whispers and speculation as Elizabeth, now officially installed as the company's president, walked with Helen towards her new office, Richard's former office. "The press releases have been sent," Helen informed, consulting her tablet. "Jennifer Rivera wants an exclusive interview, and we've already received over 50 requests from other media outlets." Elizabeth paused in front of the imposing solid wood door, observing the golden plaque that still displayed Richard's name. "Have that changed today," she instructed. "And Helen, schedule the interview with Jennifer for tomorrow. It's time for the world to meet the real Elizabeth Morgan." Upon entering the office, Elizabeth was greeted by a spectacular view of New York. How many times had she been here before, always in the role of submissive wife? Now the space would be completely redesigned, just like her life. "Ma'am," Helen interrupted her thoughts. "Alex Harrison is here, and he's brought some interesting information about the market's reaction." Elizabeth nodded, indicating to let him in. Alex entered carrying a folder and a victorious smile. "The shares have risen 15% since the announcement of the change in presidency," he informed, sitting in front of Elizabeth's desk. "The market is reacting positively to your revelation as Phoenix. Apparently, your reputation in the digital investment world is doing wonders for shareholder confidence." "And Richard?" Elizabeth asked, though her tone suggested more professional curiosity than personal concern. "He hasn't left the Plaza Hotel suite since yesterday. Beatrice Montgomery told me. He's, let's say, processing the situation." Alex hesitated before continuing. "Do you really intend to maintain the offer of the consultant position?" Elizabeth stood up, walking to the window. The city stretched out below her, an empire of concrete and glass that now partially belonged to her. "Yes, not for him, but for me. I want everyone to see the difference between us. While he tried to diminish me, I will demonstrate greatness." The phone on the desk rang. It was Robert Harrison. Elizabeth answered on speakerphone. "Elizabeth, my dear," Robert's voice sounded excited. "I just came out of a meeting with my board. We're ready to resume negotiations about the merger now that we have more competent leadership at Morgan Enterprises." "Excellent, Robert. Helen will send the new terms today. And how is Catherine?" "Ah," Robert laughed, "absolutely enchanted with the whole story. She said you're now the heroine of all trophy wives in New York. In fact, she's organizing a charity lunch and would very much like you to be the keynote speaker." Elizabeth smiled, appreciating the irony. The same social events that Richard used to display her as an accessory would now become platforms for her true power. After hanging up, she turned to Alex. "How are the preparations for the shareholders' meeting?" "All on track. The majority has already expressed support for your restructuring proposals." He consulted some notes. "Oh, and that project you wanted to implement, about the investment fund for women entrepreneurs. The lawyers have already prepared all the documentation." Elizabeth nodded, satisfied. It was a project she had been planning for years, using part of the company's profits to create a support fund for women who, like her, had potential but were underestimated. "Ma'am?" Helen entered the office again. "Beatrice Montgomery is on the line. It seems Richard is wanting to make a public statement." Elizabeth exchanged a significant look with Alex. "Put her through." "Elizabeth, darling," Beatrice's voice sounded concerned. "Richard is, well, he's in the Plaza lobby, apparently intending to give a press conference. I thought you should know." "Thank you, Beatrice." Elizabeth kept her voice calm. "Don't worry. We were expecting something like this." After hanging up, she turned to Alex. "I think it's time we implement the final phase of the plan." Alex raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Are you sure? We could just let him speak. At this point, anything Richard says will just sound like the resentment of a defeated man." "No," Elizabeth smiled, a smile that mixed determination and a hint of compassion. "Richard needs to understand that his time of controlling the narrative is over." "Helen," her assistant appeared instantly. "Yes, ma'am?" "Execute the final Phoenix protocol and schedule a press conference for an hour from now in the company's auditorium." As Helen left to fulfill her orders, Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of reflection. In her purse, she still carried her old wedding ring, a symbol of the power Richard thought he had over her. Now it was just a reminder of what she had needed to overcome to get here. "Alex," she called, her voice assuming a decisive tone, "I want you to personally deliver something to Richard before the press conference." She opened a drawer in the desk and took out a golden envelope, the same shade as the Phoenix logo that would now replace the old Morgan Enterprises brand. "What is this?" Alex asked, taking the envelope. "A choice," Elizabeth replied simply. "Richard can try his pathetic attempt at a counterattack and be completely destroyed. Or he can accept the consultancy offer and maintain his place, albeit resized, in the corporate world." "And do you think he'll choose wisely?" Elizabeth allowed herself a small smile. "Richard has always been driven by two things, power and appearances. Now that he no longer has the former, he'll desperately cling to the latter." The rest of the morning was dedicated to preparations. Elizabeth approved the new corporate design, participated in a video conference with international investors, and finalized the last details of her presentation for the press conference. When she finally arrived at the auditorium, she found it, packed with journalists and important figures from the financial market. At the back of the room, she noticed Richard. He had accepted her invitation, as she knew he would. Ascending to the stage, Elizabeth felt all eyes on her. They were no longer the looks that evaluated Richard Morgan's trophy wife, but those contemplating the woman who had built an empire in the shadows and was now emerging into the light of day. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice firm and clear. "Today marks not just a new era for Morgan Enterprises, but a moment of transformation in the American market." From the audience, Richard watched, finally understanding that his greatest defeat had not been losing the company, but spending years underestimating the woman he thought he had completely dominated. Jennifer Rivera's program was the most watched in prime time when Elizabeth entered the studio for her first official interview as president of Morgan Enterprises. Wearing an elegant white Chanel ensemble, bought with her own money, as she now made a point of mentioning, she exuded a serene confidence that made Jennifer smile in approval. "Elizabeth Morgan," Jennifer began after the initial formalities. "Or should I say Phoenix? There are so many titles to choose from now." Elizabeth smiled, settling into the studio armchair. "Elizabeth is fine, Jennifer. Phoenix was necessary. While I needed to operate in the shadows, now I can finally be who I really am." "And who are you really, Elizabeth?" "Because I confess that we all thought we knew Richard Morgan's devoted wife, but clearly there was much more beneath the surface." "You know, Jennifer," Elizabeth adjusted in her chair, her gaze direct to the camera. "For years, many people saw me as just a trophy wife, someone who was lucky to have a husband who took care of everything. What they didn't realize is that while they were underestimating me, I was building something much bigger." "The famous Project Phoenix," Jennifer complimented, leaning in with interest, "which we now know wasn't just a mysterious investment fund, but a meticulous transformation plan." "Exactly. But it wasn't just about taking control of the company." Elizabeth made a significant pause. "It was about proving that women like me, who are constantly underestimated and controlled, have much more to offer than society imagines." On the studio's big screen, images began to pass showing the recent events. Elizabeth's revelation as Phoenix, the positive market reaction, headlines about the revolutionary changes she was implementing in the company. And speaking of changes, Jennifer consulted her notes. "You announced yesterday the creation of $1 million fund to support women entrepreneurs. Can you tell us more about this?" "It's a very special project for me," Elizabeth visibly animated. "The Phoenix Fund will identify talented women who, like I once was, have potential but face barriers, whether social, financial, or familial. We'll offer not just investment, but mentorship and a support network." "And how did Richard react to all these changes?" Jennifer asked, touching on the point everyone wanted to know about. Elizabeth maintained her elegant composure. "Richard is going through an adaptation process. I offered him a consulting role in the company because I believe talents shouldn't be wasted, even if they need to be redirected." The interview continued, with Elizabeth answering each question with a perfect blend of sincerity and diplomacy. When it ended, Jennifer hugged her, whispering, "You've just become an icon for thousands of women." Back in her office, Elizabeth found Helen waiting with the latest updates. "The interview is already making waves on social media," her assistant informed. "The Phoenix Fund received over 1,000 applications in the last 2 hours." "Excellent." Elizabeth removed her pearl earrings, the last gifts from Richard that she still wore. "And how's the rebranding process going?" "On track. The new visual identity will be revealed next week during the official launch of the fund." Alex entered the room carrying a folder. "Elizabeth, you need to see this. The board just unanimously approved all your restructuring proposals." "Including the international expansion?" "Especially that. The Zhangs were particularly impressed with your plan for the Asian market." Elizabeth smiled, remembering how Richard had lost that important contract in Singapore, a key piece in her plan that now revealed itself to be even more brilliant. "And Robert Harrison called," Alex continued. He said the merger could be even bigger than we initially planned. Apparently, other groups are interested in being part of the new conglomerate. Elizabeth walked to her office window, observing the city that she now saw from a completely different perspective. She was no longer the wife who accompanied Richard to endless business dinners. She was the leader that other executives now sought for strategic partnerships. "Ma'am," Helen interrupted her thoughts. "Beatrice Montgomery is on the line. It seems Richard has finally decided to leave the plaza." "Sweet." Elizabeth nodded, picking up the phone. Beatrice's voice sounded excited. "Elizabeth, darling, you won't believe it. Richard just formally accepted the consultant position." "As I imagined he would," Elizabeth replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "He was always very concerned with appearances. Being a consultant for the company sounds better than being the ex-president who lost everything to his own wife." After hanging up, Elizabeth turned to her team. "Alex, prepare a press release about Richard's appointment as a consultant. I want a positive tone, emphasizing the importance of his experience for the company's future." "You're truly incredible," Alex commented admiringly. "Even after everything, you can still be diplomatic." "It's not diplomacy, Alex. It's strategy." Elizabeth picked up one of the new business cards Helen had brought, elegant on black paper, with the phoenix symbol in gold. "True strength isn't in destroying your opponents, but in transforming them into allies, even if in more suitable positions." The rest of the day was dedicated to meetings and planning. Elizabeth reviewed the projects for the company's new headquarters, approved investments in promising startups, and finalized the details for the Phoenix Fund launch. At night, when she finally returned to her new penthouse in the Upper East Side, she had left the mansion to Richard. In a gesture that the press called supreme elegance, Elizabeth found a message from Jennifer Rivera. "Your story inspired thousands of women today. The hashtag #BeYourOwnPhoenix has been trending since the interview. You've started a revolution, Elizabeth." Sitting on her balcony, observing the lights of New York, Elizabeth reflected on her journey. From trophy wife to one of the most powerful executives in the country, she had not only conquered her freedom, but was paving the way for other women to do the same. Her phone vibrated with a notification. It was a message from Richard, the first since her revelation as Phoenix. "You won, Elizabeth. And the worst part is that you won by being much better than I ever was." Elizabeth didn't respond. There was no need. The true victory wasn't in humiliating Richard, but in proving that she had always been much more than he managed to see. The Phoenix had been reborn from the ashes of her forced submission, and now her flight was just beginning. Outside the penthouse, a discreet car briefly parked. The driver left an envelope at the reception and silently departed into the night. Inside the envelope, documents that would forever change the fate of the Morgans awaited the dawn. 6 months had passed since Elizabeth's revelation as Phoenix. The main auditorium of the new Morgan Harrison Enterprises headquarters was packed for the first annual event of the Phoenix Fund. On stage, Elizabeth observed with satisfaction the hundreds of attentive faces, businesswomen, executives, and entrepreneurs who had benefited from her initiative. "When I began this journey," she started her speech, her voice carrying a mixture of strength and emotion, "many saw me only as someone's wife, a luxury doll without her own will or ambitions. Today I stand here not just as the president of one of the largest companies in the country, but as living proof that we should never allow others to define our limits." In the front row, Alex smiled proudly beside his father, Robert Harrison. The merger between the companies had created one of the largest business conglomerates in North America, with Elizabeth and Robert sharing leadership in a partnership that revolutionized the market. The Phoenix Fund has already invested in over 100 women-led companies, Elizabeth continued, as images of success stories passed on the screen behind her. "But more important than the financial investment is the message we're sending. No woman needs to be content with the crumbs of power that others decide to give us." Among the audience, Elizabeth noticed a familiar figure, Richard, sitting discreetly at the back of the auditorium. In recent months, he had surprised everyone by fulfilling his role as a consultant with unexpected dedication. The arrogant man who once commanded everything with an iron fist had given way to someone more reflective, who now actually listened to others' opinions. "Our latest initiative," Elizabeth announced, prompting murmurs of anticipation from the audience, "is the WINGS program. In partnership with the country's leading universities, we will offer full scholarships to women who, like I once was, have potential but face barriers to realizing their dreams." The applause was thunderous. On the side of the stage, Helen, now executive director of the Phoenix Fund, smiled with approval. She had been one of the first to believe in Elizabeth's potential long before anyone else. After the event, during the celebration cocktail, Elizabeth was circulating among the guests when Richard approached. "Impressive," he said, his voice carrying a humility that would have been unthinkable months ago. "You've built something extraordinary, Elizabeth." "Thank you, Richard," she observed him with interest. "How's the work with the fund's startups?" "Going? Surprisingly rewarding." He gave a small smile. "You know, one of the entrepreneurs reminded me of you. The same determination in her eyes." "The difference is that now you can see that determination," Elizabeth commented softly. Richard nodded, thoughtful. "You taught me the most important lesson of my life, Elizabeth, and in the most painful way possible. It wasn't about hurting." "Here, Richard." Elizabeth picked up a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "It was about showing that relationships, personal or professional, need to be built on mutual respect, not control." Before Richard could respond, Alex approached with an excited expression. "Elizabeth, the Dubai investors just confirmed. They want to be part of the international expansion of the Phoenix Fund." Elizabeth smiled, politely excusing herself from Richard. There was a whole world waiting for her now. The rest of the night was a parade of successes and celebrations. Elizabeth met dozens of inspiring women, each with a story of overcoming and determination. The Phoenix Fund had become more than an investment project. It was a movement of social transformation. Near the end of the event, Jennifer Rivera, who had become a great friend, pulled Elizabeth to a quieter corner. "You changed the game, Elizabeth," Jennifer commented, observing the room full of powerful women networking. "It's no longer about proving our worth to men. It's about recognizing our own power." Elizabeth nodded, remembering her own journey. You know what's most ironic? Richard spent years trying to keep me dependent on him, treating me like a luxury doll. If he had treated me as an equal, maybe I would never have needed to create Phoenix. But then many of these women wouldn't have the inspiration and support they have today, Jennifer observed. The following morning, in her office on the top floor of the new headquarters building, Elizabeth was reviewing the numbers for the last quarter with Helen when a special notification appeared on her tablet. "What's that?" Helen asked, noticing. Elizabeth's smile. "The first company funded by the Phoenix Fund has just gone public," Elizabeth replied, proud. "A technology startup created by a young executive who, like me, was constantly underestimated." The phone rang. It was Alex with more news. "Elizabeth, you won't believe it. That project you suggested Richard supervise, he just closed an impressive international partnership." "Great," Elizabeth responded, genuinely pleased. "He's finally using his talents the right way." At the end of the day, alone in her penthouse, Elizabeth contemplated the city that now looked so different from 6 months ago. Her cell phone vibrated with a message from one of the Phoenix Fund beneficiaries. "Thank you for showing us that we can be much more than others expect of us. Be your own Phoenix." Elizabeth smiled, thinking about how a story that began with submission and control had transformed into a narrative of empowerment and transformation. The Phoenix had been reborn not just for her, but for all women who dared to dream beyond the limits imposed by others. On her desk, the old Cartier watch that Richard had given her, a symbol of an era when he controlled even her time, now marked not just the hours, but the rhythm of a new era. An era in which women like Elizabeth no longer had to choose between being underestimated or feared. They could simply be who they were, powerful, competent, and free. The Phoenix had spread. Its wings and its flight was inspiring others to do the same. Dear listeners, Elizabeth's story is more than a narrative of revenge. It's a powerful reminder that we should never allow others to determine our worth or limit our potential. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexities of life and power. If you also have a story of overcoming to share, leave it in the comments. We'd love to hear about your journey of transformation. And don't forget, within each of us there's a phoenix waiting to be reborn. Until next time,